So just to ground us in the conversation, I think the description in the brochure captures it well, and I'll be uncreative and just read it off to folks. It says, philanthropy has too often remained trapped in the small is beautiful world of social innovation. For-profit investors have tried to avoid a view that they're compromising returns for social impact, and a growing set of trailblazers is mobilizing significant pools of capital to deploy for social impact. And this is to talk a little bit about that, the challenges, the opportunities, the pitfalls, and what it really takes to do that. And I think we're very lucky to have not just a set of panelists, but people in the audience that have very real experience in making this happen. But before we get started, a tiny bit of audience participation. So kind of take things out of your hands, because there will be some standing and sitting. First of all, for those of you in the room, please stand if you are part of an organization that you think works for social impact. Okay. Okay, everybody remain standing. So remain standing if your organization, to complete its mission, has raised more than $100,000 at a time. Has raised more than $1 million at a time. Has raised more than $10 million at a time. Has raised more than $25 million at a time. Has raised more than $100 million at a time. I would say, everyone who is still standing, please take me to dinner. The second question is, okay, please stand if you invest in social impact organizations. Please remain standing if the largest check you've written is larger than $100,000. Larger than $500,000. Larger than $1 million. Larger than $10 million. Larger than 50? Okay. The people that theoretically would have been standing could also take me to dinner. To give a little bit of context, as we think about those numbers, in the public equity markets, small companies are defined as companies with a market capitalization of between $300 million and $2 billion. Micro cap companies are defined as market cap of between $50 and $300 million. And they had to come up with a new term to describe things so small they don't fit into that, which is nano cap, which is less than $50 million. And I was just Googling nonprofit sizes and social change organization size. They refer to the size cutoff for small as $100,000 in annual revenue. So just, when we were talking about this morning, George had a nice little analogy from an important cultural reference of your Crocodile Dundee.
I don't know how many people, is this working? Yes. I don't know how many people have seen Crocodile Dundee, but there's a scene where they're getting mugged and his girlfriend says, "Eek, a knife!" And Crocodile Dundee says, "That's not a knife." And he says, "Now that's a knife."
Yeah. I think one of the questions as we think about what scale means can be highly relative in different contexts. So, I just basically want to turn things over to the folks here to talk about the topic. And as I said, we're very lucky to have some real doers here, folks that haven't just thought about this, but have actually done the work in this space to share a little bit about what they've done. I think starting on the more commercial side in terms of capital and enterprises, Jean-Philippe, and everyone, you can read their bios in the materials, but Jean-Philippe, Blue Orchard, $900 million in microfinance, did one CDO with $110 million before CDO was a four-letter word, which it is today. But and what I'd like to start the conversation, each panelist to talk about experiences they've had raising expansion capital for social impact, what it was, why they think it worked, and things they learned along the way that might be some cautionary tales for all of us out here thinking about this. So maybe Jean-Philippe, if you could get us kicked off.
Sure. I'm not sure I'll be able to speak to all your questions now, but in the course of the conversation, feel free to ask more questions. You know, we started, actually tomorrow it will be 8 years that we started Blue Orchard Finance in Geneva. And our vision at the beginning was, you know, we like microfinance. We believe that microfinance, when it's well done, can have significant social impact in the field for low-income families. But we believe that microfinance organizations should be run as businesses, should become sustainable, because it's a guarantee for long-term impact and fast growth. On the other hand, we were sitting in Geneva, which is a place with many private banks and private investors, and we said, well, wouldn't it be nice if we could, through our work, channel some of that money to microfinance organizations? So we started, you know, with $10 million in a little fund, and that was 8 years ago. Slowly build track record, and today, as John was mentioning, Blue Orchard Finance is managing, I believe, outstanding loan portfolios through different products that we created over time of about $800 million. And we're helping, hopefully, about 150 microfinance organizations in more than 40 countries. If you sum up all the clients that are being served by those institutions, we count about 9 million micro-entrepreneurs. We think that it's been a long road. We've learned along the way. But it's certainly not the end of the road, and there's, you know, barely scratching the surface of needs in terms of microfinance market. So hopefully, you know, we can continue. About 2 years ago, we realized that in the market of microfinance and looking at microfinance institutions, the bottleneck for growth was probably private equity and capital. So we decided to, you know, building on our knowledge of the market of the past 6 years, to launch a private equity fund. We've raised so far $130 million that we are deploying with a specialized team to microfinance institutions of different categories, helping them to recapitalize, maybe consolidate the industry and grow faster. And then at the same time, we realized that helping low-income families and working poor get access to financial services was very nice, but that was not the whole story. And low-income families and working poor also do need access to a lot of other services: access to education, access to health services, access to affordable housing, access to clean water, access to energy, etc. And we said, well, if we were successful and lucky in doing microfinance investments and helping microfinance companies grow sustainably and reach out to millions of customers, maybe we can help some companies targeting base of the pyramid, targeting low-income families in emerging markets, delivering sustainably and profitably all those services that poor families need, and to improve their living standards. And you know, we instead of, you know, that's maybe the general way of doing things at Bamboo and Blue Orchard, but instead of theorizing and coming with a perfect plan, we said, well, you know, let's just do it. So we went and see a couple of investors, sold them on the track record of Blue Orchard, and said, well, we believe that after talking to specialized organizations, you know, such as Ashoka, the Schwab Foundation for Social Entrepreneurship, and many others, that there were a subset of social entrepreneurs having created companies in need of private capital to expand and grow faster. So specifically with the Bamboo Finance company, what we're trying to do is to, well, first of all, we build the fund from which we invest on a very flexible basis. We can go basically anywhere in the world, in any sector we like, with any sort of instruments, from debt, convertible debt, equity, so that we can stick and be the closest to the needs of the social entrepreneurs, because it's, you know, it's different on a case-by-case basis. We want to focus on expansion stage because we feel that that's where our money can have the largest impact. And we do that on a commercial basis, not again because we love money, but because we feel that it's the only way to get access to the basic major pools of capital in the world that are still sleeping out there, and that we would like to channel to social entrepreneurship and base of the pyramid sustainable investments. That's it in a nutshell.
And quick question on to the point of tapping into those pools of capital, you know, which you did in getting the $900 million for Blue Orchard. So other than, as you said, luck and good fortune? I'm sure there was a little more that went into successfully doing that.
Well, that's part of it as well. No, I think there are stages in the fundraising. Essentially, at the beginning, you start with venture philanthropists or people who can put at risk some money and believe in you and believe in your objective and relate to it. And they are the angel investors. They are the key people to start the type of business we have started. Because essentially they can write off their investment from day one, and if we don't lose that money, then their investment will be tremendously leveraged by tons of money that are coming in the future. So in terms of social impact or economic impact, this is a wonderful way for philanthropists to in my opinion, to spend their money. And then as you progress, you build track record, and hopefully you don't have too many accidents on the road, not too many defaults. And by the way, for instance, with Blue Orchard, I think to date we have extended more than 890 loans with no defaults whatsoever. So you basically start building trust and track record, and then you start talking to private banks, private investors, and slowly you get pools of private capital that would not have come in day one. And then you keep growing. You then reach a certain scale, which is very important, in my opinion, in the asset management business, not only for your company as a management company, but also because the next stage is then institutional investors' money, and those guys are not deploying their money in tiny funds. They are deploying money when they can write tickets of $30, $40, $50 million and upwards. And at the same time, they don't want to represent 50% of your fund. They want to represent 5 or 10% of your fund. So there's, that's the next stage of getting to those pools of capital. So you have to be patient. You start during 3 or 4 years building your track record with venture philanthropic money. Then you progressively include private investors, and then the next stage is definitely institutional money. And that's where you hit the biggest pools of capital.
Great. So next up on the other end of the spectrum, from tapping to the deep pools of investment capital to tapping into deep pools of philanthropic capital. George Overholser worked with nonprofit finance fund capital, and they have raised over $250 million in philanthropic capital for expansion phase investments in generally nonprofits focused on social impact. So,
thanks, John.
Same question in terms of where you've raised it and what you think has made it successful, and then questions or notes or observations, cautionary tales along the way.
And I should hasten to add that we actually didn't raise the money. We act as a catalyst to help our clients raise the money. We like to joke. We say we're in the irresistible ask business. The basic story is, like I guess a growing number of people, I had a financial services background and a venture capital background, and about 7 or 8 years ago got very interested in the venture philanthropy model, and loved this metaphor of trying to, for nonprofits, approximate the role that's played by runway capital. And that is money that you burn through whilst en route to establishing a sustainable nonprofit enterprise. And I worked very closely with an outfit called New Profit, which many of you may know about, which has had terrific results. Now, one of the problems, though, that New Profit found and that the portfolio organizations found was as they got through those early stages of sustainable growth, they then got interested in larger scale expansion. And the laws of physics seemed to change there, and the model really started to break down. For one thing, that to bring an organization up to prominent scale, we're talking about 10, 20, 30, sometimes considerably more money than that. And we move away from single grants from single funders into the need to have several funders syndicate together under a single investment. And there really was not a lot of experience doing that in the field. The other thing that I saw were kind of unintended consequences, strange behaviors, it seemed, that where the metaphor broke down. So, for example, I would have a meeting in the morning with a venture capital client, and the CEO would be very excited. Hey, we got our $10 million, high five, and all this. And then they would sober up very quickly, and they say, our revenues are still zero. We got to get working now. And then in the afternoon, we would have our venture philanthropy meeting. Similar thing with the nonprofit. Everyone's high-fiving, and we got our big check. And then the executive director would say, not only that, we're done for the year. look at our revenues, they're through the roof. We got a big surplus. If I go out and try to raise money now, everyone's going to say, why don't you come back when you need the money anyway? And so there's this dynamic that we have sometimes in the nonprofit sector where large checks lead to dependency relationships. You get a big check, the cost structure goes up, there's a reluctance to spend a lot more time doing the painful fundraising, and so the fundraising muscles, if you will, atrophy. And then when the grant runs out, there's this very uncomfortable situation of a larger cost structure with actually a reduced ability to sustain that cost structure. And so in their wisdom, and I do mean wisdom, funders would say, well, therefore I'm not going to write large checks. I don't really think it's helpful to the mission to create dependency relationships because many funders view themselves as catalytic types of funders as opposed to sustaining funders. The other thing I saw that kind of blew my mind a little bit was in the venture capital world, let's say Kleiner Perkins is investing in a company. Well, if someone hears about that, they say, hey, I want in, this sounds great, can we co-invest? Whereas in the nonprofit sector, if a funder comes with a sizable check, it seems like all the other funders go running the other direction. And they say, well, we'll come back when you need the money. Which is a natural response, but it's very frustrating for the entrepreneurs because the entrepreneurs feel like they have a strategy that they put together that they'd like to enact. And the strategy takes them from one level of sustainable impact to a new ratchet step level, which once achieved is sustained by some sort of a business model, often a nonprofit business model that has long-term charitable flows associated with it. But the transition cost, or the what we'd like to say is the deficit incurred en route to sustainability, is a big number. It's like crossing a desert. It's 10 million, 20 million, 30 million. And so the entrepreneurs I was speaking with during this expansion stage would say, you know, I'm trying to cross the desert. I want to water up my camel. But my camel gets 2 sips of water, and I get 100 yards into the desert. I have to turn around and come back and rewater the camel over and over again. And every time I rewater the camel, it's with a different funder talking about a different pitch. I feel like I never get any place. So that was kind of our mission, was to try to create a new type of funding that was very equity-like. And the insight that we brought to it was that this asset class is missing in the nonprofit sector, that everything is revenue. You don't have a separate way to keep track of who were those funders that paid for the interim deficits incurred en route to an institution which once built has a sustainable business model, which may or may not have charity as part of it. And here's the rub, and this is the irresistible ask. If you can do that, if you can set those types of funders aside, you can build a capital campaign around it. You can say, you know, capital campaigns are something that's tried and true. We know in this sector how to raise $20 million for a building or for an endowment, both of which are permanent things you can point to and say, who did that forever? It's like a naming opportunity. And our work was to create an accounting treatment that made it possible to look at a third permanent thing, that being an enterprise with staying power. And so we work with clients who have a strategic plan to go from one place to another place that has staying power. We help them tally up what the deficit incurred en route to that new place is. We call that philanthropic equity. And then we help them craft an ask around that says, instead of $20 million to pay for next year's program execution, let's use $20 million to build an enterprise that will figure out another way to pay for every year's program execution. So it's a much more powerful philanthropic ask. The return on investment is a perpetuity as opposed to a one-time thing. And maybe I'll stop there because I could go on forever.
And I guess one quick, has it worked?
Well, how do we define work? We set this up, NFF Capital Partners, we set it up 3 years ago. Our first goal was we use the word witness $300 million of investment through this methodology. We call it the SEGWAY methodology, Sustainable Enhancement Grant. And to date, we have about $250 million that we have been involved with one way or another. Some very heavily involved and others on a lighter touch consulting basis. Several of these organizations are too early to tell. And some of the earlier experiments that I did before formalizing this thing have been organizations that you may know of. I was just speaking with Dennis Whittle. Dennis, are you in the room? No, you may not know Dennis. Dennis is the founder of Global Giving, which is a platform that gets people to invest in grassroots types of opportunities around the world. He has burned through, sometimes we call it burn capital. He's burned through 10 million of this equity-like capital. And he's this close to turning the corner on a sustainable business model that directs $20 million every year towards these very exciting grassroots investment opportunities. So the thing that works is you say 10 million once created a perpetuity of 20 million. And this is Bernie Madoff type of returns, right? Yeah. Maybe
another
they're
reference point.
Let's hope they're more believable than that. But I don't know how many people can put $10 million in the bank and have it throw off $20 million a year forever. But that's kind of the proposition. Cool. If Dennis didn't have the growth capital to burn through, he could not have built the platform which people are now using to direct their philanthropy.
Great. And then one of the things I think that has come up in both what you heard Jean-Philippe and George say is the phrase business model. And getting down, which is, I think folks are here using generically for the enterprise revenue economic model for whatever type of enterprise we're talking about. And I think one of the things that's really exciting, the work that Ashish and the Modern folks have done is really look at that question, digging in, and there's a great report I think they're just releasing that if you should make sure you get your hands on it, studying those business models for 300 enterprises focused in the social sector, primarily in India, to really dig into what works, what doesn't work, what can scale, and what can't, and to really have that fact base in a slightly agnostic way, not starting necessarily on the commercial side or on the nonprofit side, but really digging into that thing at the core, which is the business model. So maybe Ashish could share a little bit about what you guys have found.
I'm based out of India now, and I've been in the consulting world for about 15 years with Monitor. And I started in India in 1998, helping grow the practice. But it was very clear that the biggest problems we were facing was not helping big companies in India grow faster, but the social space. Great GDP growth, fantastic benefits, mostly going to the top 20% and not percolating down. Now, the other thing in parallel is, today in India, lower income households, as Jean-Philippe alluded to, are actually spending money on healthcare, education. 86% of healthcare is paid out of pocket, not government. 60% of the kids in urban India go to private schools, including low-income kids, but the quality of service they get is very poor. At the same time, there's been a lot of push about using market-based solutions for social good. Prahlad wrote a book on it. And what we observed is while conceptually all this should work fine, it wasn't on the ground. We weren't finding organizations at scale. And Jean-Philippe wants to give them money to scale, but if they're not scaling, what's the point of their expansion capital? So that's the place we started from. What's going on? Why aren't they scaling? And what we realized is that the fundamental element is the business model. End of the day, for something to scale, you need a robust business model such that the revenues cover all the costs. And I say all the costs because we come across a number of organizations which get some grant funding which allows them not to look at the entire cost structure and have a problem. Let me give you an example of what I mean. First and foremost, what we realize is when you're working with low-income households, their situation is very different from the top of the income pyramid. And therefore, the business models that work at the top may not work at the bottom. Case in point, microfinance. End of the day, what is microfinance? It's a personal loan. If any one of us in this room wants to walk in and get a personal loan, we walk into a bank, we meet the bank officer, he looks at us, looks at our credit history, looks at what outstanding liabilities we have, what our assets are, and then decides whether he'll give us a loan or not, and what interest rate to charge to compensate him for his risk, and a tenor which matches what we really need. Now, if a low-income customer earning $100 a month walks in, there's no way that bank officer will even waste his time looking at him. The cost to serve him is too high. Now, that's what microfinance did. First, instead of one person, put 6 of them together, so your ticket size went up. Secondly, you can't do detailed credit risk, put 6 of them together and say, hey, you don't pay, the others all suffer. You guys will never get a loan again. So it's not, milk of human kindness. It's very, very practical. You've taken the thing that matters to them, access to finance, and use that to enhance credit. And the third thing is no fancy tailored product. It's one size fits all. It's a 1-year loan, 5,000 rupees, that's all you get, which allows me to use a very low-cost distribution system. I don't need a fancy bank officer with a bachelor's degree. Fundamentally different business model to provide the same need all of us have, a personal loan. And that's what we started realizing as we started getting into different organizations. We realized that some of them had understood this and were actually getting at extremely interesting business models. And this report sort of talks about all of them. It's 160 pages, guaranteed to put you to sleep. But we've come across 7 really interesting models, and then what we've been doing now is seeing how to get them to scale. And I think that's where the challenge is. When you're coming out with a new business model, you often have to build all the pieces of the ecosystem, because when you're working with this income group, the other pieces aren't there. So in a higher income group, you make cars, you don't have to worry about actually supplying gasoline. In a lower income group, when you're starting to put together a microfinance organization, not only do you have to give the loans, you've got to train those guys who have no BCom degree, no bachelor's in commerce, but are just 10 standard graduates. So you've got to put the whole value chain together. So all I want to say is, A, traditional business models often won't work for low-income households. B, those business models are going to take time and energy to actually get to scale. And therefore, when we think of expansion capital, we have to be very, very cognizant of that. And I actually see the bridge between what George was saying of a little bit of soft funding to help develop those models so that Jean-Philippe can actually invest in them and get large pools of capital to come into it. Sorry, I've taken a little bit of time, but I thought I'd give you the context. That's exactly right.
Exactly.
I should be sitting in the middle, though.
We can move around. You know, we're into getting up, getting down, all these kinds of things. So in a second, I'm going to call actually on a few people in the audience, but I just wanted to follow up sort of on one point that came up. We were having breakfast this morning talking about this, and to that conveyor belt concept. I think one of the framing questions one of you asked is, why do we do any of this stuff, right? And the question to some degree got to, there's some areas where capitalism and markets work, somewhere it might work and it might not, we don't know. And to the point of venture philanthropists seeding something and taking that risk to see if it takes off or not. And there's some areas where it won't, but we need to come up with an efficient model to do that. And it was, for me, it was a really interesting lens to think about the latter. And I have all sorts of questions I want to ask you, but first I want to, you know, one of the nice things about being at Skoll is you have people every bit as qualified as all of us who are sitting in the audience who have done great work. And so a couple other examples I just see in the crowd of people that have raised expansion capital for social impact. Ron from Shorebank, maybe if you could grab a mic for a second and just in 60 seconds, your organization, what it does, recent capital raise that you completed with expansion capital, how you did it, and why you think it worked.
Thanks, John. The Shorebank is a regulated bank holding company. We created it 35 and a half years ago for initially to do inner-city rehabilitation, first in Chicago. It's expanded to a number of other cities, and we created the nation's first environmental development bank on the West Coast about 11 or 12 years ago. We also got involved probably about 25 years ago on the international side, first with Grameen and BRAC, and then with many countries in Eastern Europe. The last, what John's referring to, the most recent capital raise, we raised $31 million of new, mostly common equity for Shorebank Corporation, the holding company. And that was raised in the same old-fashioned shoe leather way that we've raised capital forever, writing an offering circular, having a business plan, going out to the likely prospects, and just raising capital. The other one that you didn't ask about was a $62 million capital raise that our consulting company, Shorebank International, did for BRAC. It was a debt offering to enable BRAC to enlarge its programs in Africa. That was it was a pretty interesting structure to that. I won't get into it, especially since I don't know all the details. But what I found most fascinating about it is that the smallest piece of it was both the lowest return and the highest risk. And that piece was necessary in order to make the larger amount work. And Lori Spengler and her colleagues did a great job there.
And one other thing on the BRAC raise, which we invested in for someone, is it's a good illustration of the conveyor belt principle, which is BRAC, when they first started in the particular countries, which were a couple countries in North and East Africa, grant funding, And then this raise, which includes some sort of discounted capital, mainly from development finance agencies and some foundations, and a chunk of capital that's a little more commercial, and sort of that's kind of you putting the conveyor belt to work to raise these chunks of capital. And then I'd seen Peter Kellner in the audience, but I think he got up and left, who just had a happy announcement raising $70 million yesterday for OboPay, a business that does base of the pyramid mobile payments. But we can't hear about the success story because I think he ran off. David Green, do you want to take maybe a sec to talk about the iFund? And I guess same 4 questions as Ron.
Yeah, this is, well, the iFund hasn't closed yet, but we're hoping that it will next month. This is a $16 million debt financing for eye care programs that are already self-financing but need funding to scale. And this is also accompanied by a $1.6 million grant fund to provide capacity building services kind of as a credit enhancement to the loan recipients. The iFund is a collaboration of Deutsche Bank, the fund manager, and International Agency for Prevention of Blindness, which is a large consortium of eye care organizations that's global, and Ashoka. And so it was through IAPB, the global affinity group of eye care, that Deutsche Bank was able to source their investing pool. Similar to the fund just mentioned, Deutsche Bank took the first loss cushion position with $1 million, and then there were a couple of other investors that put in funding at like 1% return, being the first loss cushion piece. And then we have Overseas Program Investment Corporation of the United States, several foundations like the Bernard Newcomb Foundation, and then the French government and Storebrand, a Norwegian insurance company. So it's a layered fund with different levels of risk and return. And the whole iFund was kind of built on the premise that through work that myself and my partners have done, we've created like 250 eye care programs that are self-financing from user fees, but need funding to scale. So this is an attempt to bring in debt financing to augment the grant financing.
And as I understand it, kind of to the concept George had earlier, one of the uses of funds is there's an upfront cost to transition from the traditional developing market healthcare model of very low volume, high cost to very high volume, low cost, and there's a cost to that transition. Once that cost is paid, you can be sustainable, but you got to pay for that cost to get to the new sustainable business model.
Yeah, many of the eye care programs that I've developed that are self-financing, also the manufacturing that I set up to reduce the price of eye care supplies, all of that was started with donated money, but with a plan in place where right from the start the entities could become self-financing. So definitely grant money played a key role to get things rolling. And we were fortunate. We carefully planned out to not have too much grant funding. So most of the entities that we've developed are self-financing within the first year.
Thanks, David. So I guess before we turn it over to all of you, I had just a couple questions that occurred to me listening to the conversation. One is, in the description of this panel, words like trailblazers and reinventing and innovation are in this description, yet I marked in 3 of the 4 talks, people used either the phrase old-fashioned or tried and true or proven. And so I'm a little confused. Are we being old-fashioned and using tried and true methods, or are we being innovative and doing something new and different?
I can do in our case. In our case, we're mixing and matching. I would say we're adapting some methodologies that were tried and true in one context and seeing if we can place them into another context. So in our case, what's tried and true is large syndicated capital campaigns for permanent things like buildings and endowments. The twist, which is very different than history, is an accounting treatment that creates an equity category for a nonprofit. Now, that doesn't mean you get your money back. You don't. I mean, it's funny, they call them nonprofits. Actually, if you truly are a nonprofit, that means you're going to be bankrupt soon. So you have to be profitable. In the American tax code, what the 501c3 really is about is that you have a non-distribution constraint. It means you can't distribute your profits. And so when people looked at that way back when, they said, well, if you can't distribute profits, you don't need to keep track of those, and therefore we don't need equity. So we're going to do away with the concept of equity. And I think that's too bad, because there's a role, a stakeholder role, that goes along with being an equity stakeholder that has to do with protecting fledgling organizations until they become strong enough to be so compelling to their prospective customers that the customers just want to use them to turn their money into program execution. So that's the innovation, which is somewhat trailblazing, combined with the tried and true approach, which is a capital campaign.
Yeah, Jean-Philippe.
Yes, maybe a word. I've spent the last 8 years trying to convince private investors to come in microfinance and now into other stuff. I came to realize that revolution doesn't work if you want to get to the big pools of capital. You have to talk the talk of the guys that that are sitting across the table, and not scare your interlocutor with mixed signals saying, I'll be social, but don't worry, I'll get your money back. And I do believe that you have to talk the talk of the private investor. And then once you get the trust of the private investors, once you have established the connection with the private investors, then you push the envelope. But going too rough, too hard, too quickly doesn't work, in my little experience. And we've taken time to develop trust with a significant number of significant investors from the private world of capital, building trust on the microfinance side, and now, insidiously, slowly talking about, investing for profit in rural hospitals, investing for profit in, supply chains in rural areas, in for-profit schools in some ways, but from within, change from within, not change against a system. That's really what I believe in.
And then one other thing, and this really struck me in the prep conversations that we had, because I sort of started the conversation with, okay, let's scale, and let's go scale, and how do we scale, and this is going to be great, and basically everyone chided me quite sternly that, and actually I left the first conversation feeling it was quite a downer, basically that in some cases, as Ashish said, in some cases scale just isn't going to happen. In other cases, as George says, scale is this albatross of dependency and excess cost, that it's not this unambiguous, that's the end point, that's the goal. And I think as you guys had some sort of wonderfully good thoughts in terms of how to think, where it is useful, where it's not, the things to look for, the things to fear.
Well, I would just comment that it's helpful to place this in the context of the exercise you did at the beginning of this talk. We're talking about, when we talk about scale in this context, it might be from a budget of $5 million a year or $3 million a year up to a budget of $20 million a year. And that wouldn't even get you out of the, what do you call it, nano cap? I love it. And scale economies in the for-profit world don't really kick in until you're really quite large. And everything else, you're kind of in that awkward teenager level, too big to be small and too small to be big. And my experience has been that when organizations are looking for scale economies, they become quite elusive. And that really the more successful reason to scale for organizations has come out of a moral imperative to scale. It is to say, we have something that's so important here that to deprive people of this innovation, which is helping society so much, is something that morally I don't feel I can do, despite the pain of scaling, despite the awkward size that we may become when we're kind of in that teenager zone.
And Ashish, you had a good thought that they're once again down to that business model question, which is there's some business models where scale makes a difference and some where it doesn't.
I think the end of the day, you'll see me coming back to this again and again. You've got to be commercially viable. Otherwise, it's not really going to impact large volumes. But that doesn't mean every organization has to be huge. The model has to be viable. In fact, there's some which are very viable because they're small. They actually work with the informal sector. They don't necessarily give full benefits, but they give employment, and they actually will replicate well across different organizations. So again, the fundamental thing is what is the model that is robust, and then scale can happen in very, very different ways. In fact, the other thing we've noticed sometimes in a value chain, and this will go back to some of the eye care examples, while the actual operation or unit that is doing the surgeries can be relatively small, the person doing the manufacturing with the equipment has to be much bigger. So even in the value chain, your scale can vary depending on where you really get the benefits and the economy of scale. So unfortunately, scale is a much more nuanced word than just one answer for everyone.
And I would add to this too that we often use the language impact, scale of impact, as opposed to the scale of the enterprise, and that leaves room for strategies such as replication or dissemination, the words that is sometimes used as a way to get a model just out there. And one thing I'd say about the work that we're all doing is we may have an impact that is more important than the capital raising. I think what's going on, what I've observed in the last really a brief time, in 3 to 5 years, is kind of an awakening of an enterprise perspective for nonprofits, where it's less of a program orientation, and it's more of this orientation that programs in the absence of, Dan was calling it a resource engine. Some people call it business model. Some people call it a sustainability model. They're all different words for it. But this notion that you can't just have program, you need to surround the program by an enterprise and think holistically about what is the business model that you're working backwards from. And what that does is it reveals the role of growth capital, and it allows people to think more clearly about how they're going to reach their sustainable impact goals. Right now, the way the nonprofit sector has worked, as I've observed it, is because we conflate the ongoing revenues with the growth capital. An infusion of growth capital actually masks whether or not an organization is making progress towards its long-term sustainability goals. And that's a very powerful problem. So it's one of the reasons we don't write big checks. I'll write a big check, and you're going to see, if you write a big check, the organization's going to have a surplus, maybe for years to come, and you will not be able to detect whether or not the organization is growing the more kind of healthy version of its revenues. It's like good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. Right now, we can't tell the difference between those two.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I fully agree with that. The only thing is that you can commit a significant amount over time, then you just release as the company grows and meets targets, right? So the big check doesn't prevent, wise management of your big check. I mean, you can commit for the long term and then release and push for growth and push for targets.
And we're on the horns of a dilemma, because then we get into the death by 1,000 lashes. As a venture capitalist, I hear two phrases all the time, one of which I also hear all the time in the philanthropy world, and one which I never hear in the philanthropy world. The one that I never hear in the philanthropy world is this phrase that sometimes you hear, is that the first 20 million is the hardest. Right? Oh, excuse me, I got it wrong. It's the easiest, right? Because what happens is, if you've got a good business idea and a reputation as an entrepreneur, you go visit your venture capital friends, you raise 20 million over 6 weeks, and then you spend the next 5 years figuring out how to sell 20 million widgets at $1 a piece. But that first 20 million is so easy. And that never happens for nonprofits. The nonprofits don't have that turnkey capitalization or formation capital that they can go to. The other phrase that you hear very often is from management teams. They're always like complaining, and this is in for-profit as well as nonprofit. They say, man, I just wish we could finish this capital raise so I could get back to running the business. Right? Well, in the nonprofit sector, you never finish the capital raise. You never do. Because you need to kind of prove yourself in such small little steps, you end up becoming, as one of my clients called it, he said, you know what, George, I'm in the chameleon business. I feel like I'm in the chameleon business. I have to keep changing who I am over and over again.
Maybe just to finish on scale, because something is important that I'd like to mention on our approach in Bamboo and Oasis. we also look not only at the scaling of one specific business, but the replicability of the business model across countries and continents. That's very important. Growth of the specific business through franchising models is also quite interesting when you want to reach scale. You have a proven business model, you just multiply it by franchising, and I think it's an avenue that is definitely worth exploring. And then in our particular case, and I'm sure it's true for others, we very much believe in the connection between microfinance and the companies in which we invest in other fields, because in many businesses you need distribution networks. You need to reach out to millions and millions of people. Well, we believe that microfinance organizations, with their outreach to millions of people, could certainly be one distribution network for other products than just financial services. That's one thing. And then on the other hand, microfinance institutions could become the source of financing of clients of the companies in which we invest. So this connection in the field between our investment portfolios in microfinance and the tiny bamboo and oasis now slowly growing, that's a bet eventually to again reach scale.
So I have about 8 more questions, but I'm going to shut up and turn the questions over to folks here, while reserving the right to maybe sneak in a question or two of my own as things go on. So I guess raise your hand. We have our roving mic folks.
First of all, John, you did a nice job. I never heard of NanoCap, but the Nano did launch this week, so it was really good that you brought that up. It was a really great panel. I belong to a firm called Innosight Ventures. We're actually a firm founded by Clayton Christensen in Harvard Business School, and we apply disruptive innovation, all this good stuff. But we're actually a venture capital firm that uses proprietary capital to incubate pro-poor, scalable enterprises, okay? So we invest our own skin as a private equity firm, actually build the ventures up to a certain level of revenue, and then we look for investors to scale it up. Now, the question to this really great panel is, this incubator model, as far as I can tell, most private equity, and please raise your hand if you are incubating, are looking for just the deals to invest in. They're not actually building on the ground ventures, like we are. Now, we're torn because we obviously put equity and we put in resources. Now we want to scale these, and we've got them, a few of them that are doing that. What's our best way? Is it to raise a fund, which is what we're planning to do, or we are doing? Or is it just bring somebody else into the entity and just continue to pour equity into it, eventually later sell it off?
So Ashish, this is something I know you guys have thought about and acted on very directly as folks that have gotten on the ground and work with some of these businesses.
Well, I'll say a couple of things here. One is there is actually a model in the private equity world of what they call an entrepreneur in residence. And one of the best examples in India is Warburg Pincus that started a company called WNS, which is the largest outsourcing firm in India today. So I think that's a historical model. It's also had very mixed results. So Warburg also hired 4 guys in pharma, etc., and came to nothing. So it's a model which is like everything else, pluses and minuses. I do think one of the challenges in this space is a lot of the people who get into the space of social impact, part of the problem is if you really look at the opportunity, even though Prahlad pointed out and said how huge it is, most people working in developing countries have other equally large, if not larger, opportunities. So if I think of education, the entire education market for the bottom 60% of the economic pyramid in India, sized by WRI and IFC, is $5 billion a year. Big market. HP went chasing that for the laser printer market in China and did a lot to get there. But if you just run a bunch of coaching classes for middle-income kids in India, it can be a $7 billion business. So as an institution, and let me tell you that to generate $5 million of revenue from low-income kids in a school, you need to run 100 schools. Not exactly an easy proposition. So when you start thinking of the complexity of doing this, you realize that trying to build commercially viable businesses in the low-income population is a tough job. As a result of that, most people who just have a commercial hat don't go in there. The people who do tend to go in there, coming back to your point, have much more a sense of moral purpose. They may not have all the commercial skills. So you're torn. On one hand, you can say, I've got this guy, he's got a good idea, and believe me, there's no lack of ideas. We don't need 100 new ideas. How do I help the guy scale up? Versus, I think there's an interesting idea here, but this may not be the right guy. And I need to bring somebody else in to really help it scale. And I struggle with that because in Monitor, in India, we actually started a low-income housing venture. We spent the time, we developed the model. Sorry, we had to be innovative. We're a consulting firm. And I'm having a devil of a time getting real companies to get in there. So I have now incubated a low-income housing finance company. They got their license 2 weeks ago. I've also got an entrepreneur who started a software company and sold it to actually start a low-income housing company, and he wants to build 1 million houses in the next decade. So I think there is a lot of value to the incubation model, but it's not easy. And one of the problems with entrepreneurs who take your ideas, they'll do it the way they want, not the way you want. So. That's actually the easy part. Yeah. Well, you've invested, right? Yeah. But what we found is that basically they will decide whom they want to bring in. We don't have that much of a choice. And it's very easy if they're actually good and have the revenue models to get the money coming in. The tough part is that initial part of getting them to prove that it works.
And one of the themes, it feels like from the panel, is it's hard, whichever model you end up choosing to use. So if there were a magic easy answer, one of us would have probably chimed in and said, go.
But I think it's an interesting question. I mean, if I were you, and I've put my own skin, as you say, in those companies, I certainly want to somehow keep control of those and at least keep involved in their development and stay and remain involved. Do you build another fund of which you're in control? You may run into conflicts of interests, right? Obviously. How do you deploy this capital to your own incubated companies, and how do you make the calls on, which one you help, and that's a tough one. So, but I'm sure creative minds can find, partnership opportunities in that sector. Definitely.
To John's point, in the early days at Capital One, we had, maybe 500 people, and we were growing very rapidly. We ended up with 27,000 people. And somewhere along the journey, we had a board meeting, and I remember one of our board members was a co-founder of AOL, a very tough Marine type of a guy. And we said, how do we grow? How do we go? And he said, well, you could do it organic, you could do joint venture, you could do acquisition, and they all suck. But I said, thanks a lot. But, but one thing I think that is true, in the conveyor belt, I deeply believe in this conveyor belt concept. I think that the skills that come from your investors and the things that your investors can bring other than money change radically depending on where you are in your journey. So in the early days, an angel investor will give you informal advice. They'll be right down there with you. And all the way, when you get all the way to becoming, quote unquote, going public, you have very low involvement capital, but lots of it. And the price of admission there is that you need to conform to all the many kind of comfort building aspects that more investment grade investors are looking for. And there's a series of handoffs. People who do Series A do different than people who do Series B, and the private equity world has different skill sets. And by the way, Rolodex is more important, and it's kind of where you are, right? But later on, perhaps financial engineering acumen is more important, and so on. And I think that what we're doing, if you step back a level, which is, I love the way you set up this panel, is that we're trying to create this conveyor belt so that there's always a takeout. If you can have a takeout from which you're working backwards at any level, that becomes a beacon for the management team. And I do believe that when we get some more of these well-capitalized scaling stories told, it'll become a little bit like when a company is preparing to go public. They start getting visited maybe 2 years before that by the investment bankers. And the investment bankers come in with their checklist, and they say, here's what you're going to need to look like to be attractive to the capital market. And the entrepreneurs say, oh, okay, that's the way we're going to look because we want to scale. And that happens before each handoff. And I think that's kind of, that's collectively where we're all trying to get to.
I see two patient hands in the back, so maybe actually we'll get both questions and then we can tackle those.
I'm Paul Light. I'm at New York University, and we've done a lot of research on social entrepreneurs. At the heart of your question earlier was this notion that there's some kind of conflict between being socially entrepreneurial and well organized, the tried and true versus the, social edge. And I think this panel kind of demonstrates the notion that there's great value in capacity building and that we have to accept the tried and true sometimes. Maybe we have a human resource office. Maybe we have an accounting package that works. And there's this fear among social entrepreneurs sometimes that if they get these things, it'll kill their ideas. And I wonder whether you could talk just a little bit about that.
I think that was maybe well said.
I reject as false the distinction between organization and innovation.
Yes, exactly. So and not to be somewhat chiding and schoolmarmish, but if we could focus on the question side maybe a bit as opposed to the statement side.
Hi, I'm Audrey Sellian from Rienta Capital, an investment advisory to a family office focused on social investing in India. And I just wanted to ask the panel, as this, from the investor side, as the universe expands and as there are many more of us around this table looking at the usually the same deals and focusing specifically on the small and growing business segment end of the spectrum, I'd like to ask the panel what role do they see for venture philanthropy in all of this? I'm asking just the general question because obviously for the projects that entail physical infrastructure investment, we understand generally that there have been subsidies that have been given into to be able to allow developed countries to have the infrastructure that they have, and therefore subsidies in that arena in emerging markets makes sense. But how do you know when, the good cholesterol, bad cholesterol question, how do you know when the funding that you're putting in is indeed required to sort of grease the wheels and create a second round or third round of financing that will actually unlock the commercial potential versus when it's distortionary, when you see a company deploying a couple of million solar panels in a couple of areas and you find out that it's all because of a USAID grant.
So is it how to know when the money you're putting in is kickstarting a potential high leverage conveyor belt that transitions you to economic sustainability versus helping something limp along and masking real progress? So how do you, knowing that you may well need subsidy, how do you keep it accountable and focused?
I think it begins with defining something, which, by the way, you can redefine and almost inevitably will redefine several times during your journey. But at any given time, define what constitutes high-quality revenues and track those separately from what constitutes perhaps expensive revenues or disruptive revenues. So, for example, if writing grants that have heavy reporting characteristics and a grant maker's agenda that perhaps differs from your enterprise's agenda, you might call that, expensive. And the trick, I believe, the trick is to track those separately, and thereby revealing whether or not you're making progress on those types of revenues which feel more attractive to you, which may be inherently scalable. There are many sources of revenues in this world that feel great, but are not scalable. And I think that, there's kind of candy-like revenues that don't have great nutritional value. And sometimes we make the metaphor, this is metaphor on parade here, but sometimes we make the metaphor, it's kind of like climbing a tree in an effort to reach the moon. Those early branches feel great, but unless we can recognize them as such and track them separately, we may fail to make the upfront investments that are required to get those truly scalable and enduring revenues in place.
Actually, I'll go back to the revenue theme, because I think that is the key problem we've also found, that people don't really understand their revenue model. So I think when you're investing in an organization, understanding where the revenue is coming from and tracking that is a great way of knowing how sustainable the business is.
Just to push back a second on that, though, if the idea is some of the venture philanthropy money will take a chance on an unproven business model where they may not know their revenue model yet, and they may not even know if there's going to be a revenue model, how do you drive accountability to trying to at least answer the question, whether the answer is yes or no?
And I think the trick there is again, absolutely reserve the right to change your definition over time. But to go in totally blind, maybe is not that well advised. One thing that I found incredibly helpful in thinking in terms of enterprise sustainability is to kind of formulate what it is that a nonprofit firm is in the business of, and to use language slightly differently there. What I like to say is that a nonprofit, just like a for-profit, by the way, a nonprofit is in the business of turning money into program execution. It's like charity is not about just raining money down from a helicopter someplace and people's lives are better. You're actually buying something. So instead of buying tutoring for my kid from Kaplan, I'm buying tutoring from a nonprofit for some kid in Dorchester. And if we can think of those terms, then the other money, which is the venture philanthropy money, is what's used to build the thing that people use to turn their money into program execution. And if you can get that distinction down, the builders versus the buyers, that often unlocks a lot of these quandaries.
Sorry, I'm a very pragmatic guy. Trying to answer your question, drawing a parallel with the microfinance world that I know best. All the big microfinance banks that we talk about and everybody's, posting about, have been created by, grant money. Development banks were started as NGOs, and then as they grew, realized slowly sometimes that they needed to transform into for-profit models that would enable them to grow faster, develop their product ranges, become regulated, etc., etc. And along the road, philanthropy, grant money was used first to start the program, the project, and then to build the enabling environment for the growth of this transformed company. And, you talk about rating funds, about paying for audits, paying for, off-the-shelf IT systems, etc. All this has been developed by grant money. And then we now see, the emerging leaders of the microfinance world not needing anything else, not any more grants, purely commercial money. And maybe I'm wrong, but I believe that the non-microfinance social investing part will and should follow the same track. That is, you use venture philanthropy at the beginning, you create those companies, you take the risk, you have the metrics, of course, you know where you're headed, and then over time, you have the little bamboos of the world slowly growing, still in need of grant capital to assist the companies in which they're investing for several things, training of their staff, whatever, and building the enabling environment. And then hopefully one day we get to last stage where this grant money is not needed anymore.
As Audrey said, we forget sometimes that we massively subsidize a lot of these things in the UK, the EU, and the US, and we must be purely commercial. And if you look at a diagram of the subsidy capital going to provide grants and other support to small businesses in the developed world, it's a complicated, multifaceted.
The thing is, the thing is, grant money should know when it should stop. That's also very important, and have the capacity to say, I've built it, and now I pass. And that's a tough one, of course.
There is this point with your funder where eventually you have to say, sweetheart, we have to stop meeting this way. Can I just, though, add, because something that often complicates conversations like these is that a lot of the most successful investments in this impact investment world are into organizations that at some point can be sustained through an earned revenue model. There's also another class, which is the area where we work more, is, there's a reason the nonprofit sector exists, and that's because there are places where you're just never going to have a viable business. And yet, there is a different type of a market. It's a market that says there's a group of people that would like to help another group of people that aren't themselves because they think society's better off and that's something that they'd like. And that's where things get a little bit tricky, because the people who are writing the check for the capital are the same sometimes as the people who are writing the check for program execution. And that, when that becomes conflated, we lose the benefit of kind of the distinction between the role of equity finance and being just a customer.
So, next question.
If we're sitting here
social enterprise has become an established industry on a larger global scale than it is today, supported by an established banking system, where global capital can reach the corners of the world. So, going back to Ashish's comment, which I will always remember, that grassroots effort in India in healthcare and education, how can that find sort of the softer money and investors of George's organization, sort of the venture capital, private equity type, then reaching out, perfecting the model, reaching out to the larger pools of money that Jean-Philippe is in touch with. The establishment of that flow of capital, is that going to be driven over the next 10 years by market forces? Or is that going to be driven by self-regulating organizations that act in the interest of social enterprise, supported by initiatives that have been taken to government globally, turned into policy, supported and encouraged by international organizations, perhaps IMF and World Bank?
So let's do 2 more questions, and then we'll tackle the badge. Right next door.
Vincent Dawans from Virtue Ventures. Maybe a question that's somewhat related, but a bit more specific in the same context. We've been talking a lot here about capital funding coming from the private sector and in very successful models, like with Blue Orchard, for instance. I'm just curious, specifically in looking at the assets that are held by foundations in the United States and around the world. I've always found rather odd that we are asking the private sector to invest in social funds, while, as far as I know, many foundations are still investing in rather traditional instruments. What is your experience in trying to attract these foundations to finally mean what they're actually supposed to be doing and actually putting their money into these funds as well?
And then a third up in the middle.
Uli Grabenwater, European Investment Fund. I've got one question more from the other side of the spectrum, from the regulatory environment that actually is overseeing the social sector, and the split between non-profit organizations and for-profit organizations having implications, not least to the tax status and other things that are related to the business model. My question is, to what extent do you believe that has implications for social enterprises in accessing this new type of investors that actually are seeking profit in one way or the other in addressing social models? What actual implication is there that is a hurdle for social enterprises accessing this group? Or ask the question differently, is it about time that we leave also in the regulatory environment behind us the era where the definition of whether something is social or not social has been linked to whether it is for-profit or non-profit?
So 3 questions. I'll sort of recapitulate them a bit. One, over the next 10 years, the conveyor belt, what's going to drive it and make it really work? Is it going to be market forces? Is it going to be people from the dedicated social sectors? Is it going to be government? What's going to really be driving it? Number 2 is foundation assets. What's the deal? Third is this question of nonprofit, for-profit distinctions in terms of driving the different ways capital go to these enterprises. And this may be my own particular version of the question, which is one of the issues that comes up a lot is, do we need new structural forms to support a lot of this work, or do we need to work more effectively with the existing forms? And I guess maybe take the first 2 questions first, and then I want to get back to the third question as sort of its own question.
Okay, I'll start on the driving force. I don't believe in directed flows of capital from a super, organization. I believe the driving force will be twofold. One, on the receiving end, on the investees, it's just showing that there are investment opportunities, fast growth, successful companies that will inevitably attract the attention of investors, I do believe. And second, the desires, the genuine desire of a growing number of investors to touch base with reality in their investments and to add, value to their portfolio of investment, and more than just financial value. And I really do believe that this global crisis that we're seeing today is a chance for us and for this sector to actually convey the message that yes, there's another way of investing your money, and I'm convinced that it's going to be a major driving force in the few years and decades. So I don't believe in this, regulatory body that would help convey or channel flows of capital. Directed lending or directed investment don't work, in my opinion. And then, sorry, on the second question, maybe on the foundation's money, I wish to see more of it, more often, to say the least. And I'll stop there.
I would wholeheartedly agree. I'm a big believer that a local in-market entrepreneur is going to come up with better solutions than a constellation of funders, each of whom may have a different theory of change. It's a little bit like good old Copernicus, who would have who put the sun in the middle instead of having the earth in the middle. There's just a lot more parsimony if we have the enterprise that's actually doing the work have a single strategy around which everything else revolves. And I have a belief that those strategies and innovations, because they come up out of reality as opposed to coming down from ideas, are more likely to be successful, and that they will draw capital over time. On the foundation assets, it's just such a difficult problem to solve, and I think we're making good progress on it. But if you sit on the board of a foundation, you have to be prudent. And so to do things that are, and it's written right in the bylaws, and the jeopardizing investments are not something that you can do and fulfill your obligation as a board member. Then there are also practical problems, which is that you have highly compensated people managing the corpus of the foundation. And you have to work with the compensation plans to say, okay, we're going to subject you to some investments that don't perform as well as what you would probably find if you just had your pure profit hat on. And so they say, well, then you got to pull that out and put it outside of what I'm managing. And then all of a sudden you've got the board managing a set of investments themselves, and that's kind of a governance no-no. And so we need to work, we need to learn a lot more before we can really have this work smoothly. I think it can be done, but it's a lot of work.
On the first question about whether it'll just happen organically or whether there's going to be somebody broader driving it, I think it'll be market forces, but I do think it won't be commercial market forces. It'll actually be venture philanthropy firms which will step in, different people will try different things. Everyone has its own way of thinking, and that'll lead to some interesting models that other people will follow. And on the foundations question, I think at the end of the day, if you really look at the behavior of many foundations, they're actually quite risk averse. So expecting them to start putting their endowment money into this is not natural. I think it will happen, but again, you'll have the leaders who will start innovating and others will follow.
I'll just take a tiny comment on the second one because that is a little more my day job. It's hard. There are challenges. There have been some great leaders, and there's real progress being made. The Annie Casey Foundation just integrated their social investment team with their investment team. The Kellogg Foundation carved $100 million out of their endowment to do mission investing. The Skoll Foundation, our hosts, do some actually really interesting work. So is there a lot more that could be done? Absolutely. There's been a little bit of a people talking past each other problem. I mean, I got an email from some people who were advocating that foundations just carve out 5% of their money in the next 2 months to go support some troubled asset purchases with the U.S. government. I mean, I'm not joking. So, but what that's illustrative of is not that it's necessarily horrible, but that you have people talking past each other, which is when the investment people hear that, they say, well, that doesn't make sense. And the conversation ends as opposed to starts. And I think but we're still seeing progress on that front. To the first question, what we're seeing is a bit of a secular movement. We're seeing people from government, people from commercial markets, people from venture philanthropy, people from all these different sectors kind of starting to push the ball forward in different ways. And so I don't know that it's as simple as these people will follow and these people will lead. But to the second question, this was one of the questions I had wanted to make sure was covered, is new legal structures, new legal forms, new organizational forms. Is that an important critical enabler, bottleneck that needs to be dealt with to help more expansion capital for social impact? Is it a waste of time? Is it maybe important but not top priority? You know, what in your work, what have you guys found? What do you think?
That's a tough one. You know, again, sorry, being pragmatic, I take a step at a time. And in my little, scale of abilities and capacity to work, I raise from, for now, venture philanthropist, I hope to raise, in 10 years' time, billions from large pools of capital. And again, I talk their talk. And I'm using what exists today, and I'm, going in with what exists today, and I'm transforming from within when I'm in the fortress. And if sometime, some brilliant minds find new ways or new formats or new structures, I'm very happy to, to look at those. But for now, my goal is 30 million this year to help great companies, 8 to 10 companies worldwide, now get to their expansion phase. If a new form of organization of capital, is created one day, absolutely great. But that's not my focus today.
I would have to say as well that I don't think we feel particularly constrained presently by things like corporate structure or what's written, the lack of a formally hybrid entity that's both nonprofit and for-profit. Because I think the distinction really is not so much the structure as it is the underlying viability of a business model. And the question that we need to answer more is, how do we capitalize the growth of a business which capitalists aren't going to like because it doesn't throw off money, but it's still very good at doing something that we really do like, which is turning money into program execution that we could never do for ourselves. So if I had a wish list, though, I suppose the thing that I would love to see are changes in the accounting rules that make it possible to track nonprofit equity as a separate class of money from the revenue, so that we could, again, unmask whether or not progress is being made on the good types of revenues.
Just, I wanted to complement my first answer, again, drawing on my little experience of microfinance. We've lent to microfinance organizations in countries such as Colombia, to non-for-profit organizations that were by far better performers than commercial banks in other countries doing microfinance, right? Excellent efficiency, strong governance, but unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, today they have reached a stage where they need to transform into a for-profit model and company so that first they can attract capital that they need to scale, because the reinvestments of retained earnings and of income just sets the pace of your growth. And if you want to grow much faster than what you're able to plow back in your business by bringing in fresh capital, well, that's it. You have to transform today. And the second thing is that they were forced, or they are being forced to do that so that they can offer different products to their clients. They are banks. Credit-only institutions today are not fulfilling, in my opinion, their social mission. Savings, it's much more important for poor people in emerging markets than credit. Talk about insurance, et cetera, et cetera. So again, being agnostic about the not-for-profit and for-profit models of companies in which we invest, but eventually realities of the market are catching up with them in two ways. And that's, again, the experience of microfinance, but I suspect it's going to be applied to other sectors.
Questions?
Suzanne? Yeah. Question to what exactly do you promise your investors? So, as students of the CAPM model and so on, where there's a relationship between risk and return, what do you promise them of returns? Because the risk associated with this seems to be quite high. At the same time, you have to assume some losses that are probably higher than other things.
In our case, we always try to draw that analogy that we're building something permanent. It's not a building. but it's an enterprise with staying power. And so you don't get any money back, but as a first step, what you do get is the right to claim credit for having capitalized the establishment of this permanent thing. So it's a little bit like a naming right. The other thing that we have are information rights. And every quarter, we have a dashboard that all of our clients present that cover many facets, both social impact, but also what % sustainable are you now? How much growth capital did you burn through in the last quarter, and how much is left? And was there other growth capital raised, in which case the investor was subjected to dilution? So there are some of these equity-like metrics that are in place. We don't have in our arrangement now any control rights or for example, I could imagine in the future having a right of first refusal for future equity-like investment, or blocking rights even for future equity investment, which is a scary concept, but it might be an interesting one to explore about. We also don't have even governance rights at this point, where automatically an investor can sit on the board. We kind of leave that as a side deal.
The good news is you have a very clear expectation that you know you're going to meet, which is negative 100% financial return. And
Absolutely.
You know you can deliver on that.
What the premise that it, but no. Well, the thing is that usually you get negative 100% and then nothing else, right? And so our whole premise is the big question is, will you or will you not sustainably enhance this organization's ability to deliver a program that somebody loves? I love this program. I could pay for next year's execution, or I could use it as growth capital and pay the money while the organization learns how to get something else to pay for execution every year. And so the whole thing is, did the ratchet step happen or not? And we have extremely clear reporting as to whether that happened. And then the other thing is, did you get diluted?
Well, I can be very specific on your question. When we talk about microfinance, fixed income investments, the funds we're managing in the debt business for microfinance, I guess over the last 10 years, one of our funds, the largest one, has delivered the LIBOR plus 2% net in US dollar systematically over the last 10 years. Right? So no defaults. By construction, we don't mark to market, so of course no volatility. Monthly liquidity. So it's sort of attractive to private investors and institutional investors willing to, get a taste of what microfinance looks like. It's a first entry into the world of microfinance investments. Then we launched this private equity fund for microfinance. We target a 20% IRR over the next 8 years. And given our knowledge of the field and the way we're currently building the portfolio, we believe we can deliver that. And I think we meet the threshold of some, major private equity funds. But it's risky, obviously. You never know. And then finally, on the Oasis Fund, what we tell our investors is, look, we'll get the 15 to 25% IRR on our equity investments if it works. So it's extremely risky. It's new. We've never done it. We are non-specialized. We go across the board, cross sectors, cross geographies. We're a team of 3. But we've done it in microfinance. It seems to be working. So do you want to take the risk to build a path with us, to help us build track record, and your money will be leveraged. And on top of it, if we're successful, you'll get decent financial returns on top of major social impact. And that's what we're saying to the investors.
One of the points you made at breakfast is, regardless of the investment, the importance of understanding what investors are looking for, being clear about their expectations, and doing your darndest to deliver on what you promise.
Yes, don't lie to investors.
Yes.
I'm interested particularly in exits, and you've got a conveyor belt where you start with small and you get bigger, and then you have a VC fund, and then you have a fund of funds, and then it gets very exciting. But what happens at the end of the conveyor belt? Do we need a social stock exchange? And I'm sort of half leaning back to one of your points about structures, in that 2 social enterprises, I'll call them that, in the UK and Ireland that started some decades ago, one being Guinness and the other being Boots, very clear social missions, but they completely lost it when they floated. And the Adam, if you don't measure what you value, you end up valuing what you measure. And if we're only measuring that single definition of shareholder value, what are we left with? I'm struggling with it, but I'm just interested in your ideas.
So unpacking two elements there. One is exits and how do they happen at the end of this merry-go-round, who's writing a check? And two is what are the risks in terms of mission that are associated with that?
So this is a topic that I get kind of passionate about. Again, this distinction between what are revenues, which is money that a firm turns into execution of some form, versus what is capital, which is money that's inherently a one-time infusion of something. And if you look at the history of a typical for-profit company, take Apple Computer or something like that. Through the history of that company, maybe 1% or 2% was paid in capital. Everything else was money in exchange for computers. If you take Kaplan tutoring, maybe 1% of the money paid the bills while Kaplan got good enough that others would want to bring their money and ask Kaplan to turn their money into tutoring sessions. So the vast majority of money that goes into an entity, whether it be a for-profit or a nonprofit, is money in exchange for execution, which is revenue. That's not capital by my nomenclature. So that's an important thing because it says that our capital market problem actually is a lot smaller in magnitudes than perhaps we thought. It also helps you understand the concept of takeout, because many people who aren't intimately involved in capital markets may not know this, but when a company goes public, there's actually a big sucking sound for capital. It is not, the VCs or the private equity people or whoever get their money back, right? But they don't get it back from the company. They get it back from other investors who swap money for shares in the secondary market.
So, but I mean, to get to sort of how within our conveyor belt, so
within
where is
our
that
conveyor,
money coming from?
So within our conveyor belt, let's go to the end first and then you work backwards. At the end, you get taken out by the customers. Basically what happens is you burn through the money, and then in its place is this entity that is turning money into program execution forevermore, and no money ever comes back, but in its place is your program gets executed forever, and that's a successful exit, right?
So and maybe on the commercial side, because we're basically just out of time, so maybe Ashish or Jean-Philippe on the commercial side, and then we'll get to concluding remarks.
Okay, well, that's a tough question, and that's the number one question we ask ourselves when we invest, because obviously our fund has limited lives, and we need to exit at some point. But before addressing that exit question, the mission drift, I mean, the risk of losing the social, view or the social, that's something again that's been very debated in microfinance, right? I mean, you have the NGO transforming in a for-profit company, becoming a bank. Oh my God, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs are coming in, we're gonna lose, our soul. Well, could be. But I would say you have to be very, pragmatic on a case-by-case basis, and you don't just invite anyone to your capital if you want. But I do believe that, specifically in the microfinance sector, if you become a bank, it's not bad for your social impact, again, because you're capable of serving better your clients. And as long as you don't lose the focus or the initial, mission of keeping in touch with the low-income, segment and bankerize many people that have no access to financial services, nothing prevents you from, on top of that, serving the missing gap, which is now the SME sector, and then, accompany the growth of your clients. So one is not necessarily, excluding the other, and I don't believe in this automatic mission drift because you become a for-profit company and a bank and a regulated company. I don't believe in that. It may happen, you have to be very careful about it, but it's not automatic. Now to come back on the exit one, for the private equity fund, I have a dream. and it is that the private equity funds that will be launching in the next 10 years could all be bought back by a global holding sitting anywhere, I don't know, that would have this industrial vision of keeping the stakes in those microfinance banks and keeping, the focus and the mission. So not necessarily selling those stakes in 7 years to the highest bidder, but transforming, you know, this capital that we have put at work during the next 7 or 10 years into something that is permanent, hopefully. And then after that, you know, we'll see and we float or whatever, a part of it. But you maintain control on something that you're building progressively. That's really our vision. I don't know if we'll be successful in doing it. And then for the other one, frankly, it can take many forms. It can be buyback from promoters, can be, you know, buyback from other private equity funds interested in taking the next step. You know, that I don't know. It can be, you know, IPO, can be strategic sales to large companies, seeing that what you're doing is actually expanding in the markets. And if they appreciate the value of your markets, they're not going to sell or destroy. So, you know, I think there are many ways that you can exit those investments, and you have to be creative and work from the very first day towards this exit, not ask yourself the question 7 years down the road.
So I'm going to make a quick excuse so I don't get a moderator demerit, which is we were told to start 5 minutes late, so people got back from lunch, and so our finishing 5 minutes late is actually finishing right on time. Number two, just a couple last points that, you know, I was writing down throughout just in terms of trying to summarize a couple of things that sound like came up a lot, and then a lot of the detailed issues, please come up and talk to panelists, and hopefully none of them will run off to continue the conversation. But number one, business model matters. At root, having some engine where money comes in relative to where money goes out that can work over the long term, whatever it is one is doing, whatever form one is a really important end game. It can look a lot of different ways, but that's at the center of it. As someone said, it's about the enterprise perspective. Number two, size is not a panacea. In some cases, it's not doable. In some cases, as you were saying, for a lot of businesses, you saw it, it's not going to happen. And for some cases, it's not desirable. There are far better ways to scale impact than scaling the organization. Number three is this conveyor belt concept. You know, this idea that number one, subsidy is not a dirty word. That's fine, and the goal is to actually make it so it's a bridge to somewhere, not a, well, I could make a Sarah Palin joke, but I won't. And the last thing is really that a lot of this takes patience, discipline, and execution. Kind of boring, very old-fashioned things, but at root, that's really central to a lot of this work. There is no quick and easy answer, which in some ways is reassuring because it means we all haven't been morons that have overlooked it. I mean, the reality is this is really hard stuff. And I think one of the things that I took heart in is there's a great vision for the payback for people who will take risk, either as entrepreneurs or as funders. And it's not guaranteed, but that there's an emerging ecosystem, an emerging set of tools and techniques that if people will take that risk when the business model may not be clear, when there may not be other people for other interests that will come in, the chances that there's a real longer-term payoff for social benefit down the stream of that risk capital is greater than ever before. So those were my takeaways. If other people have other thoughts, come up, join other questions. But thank everybody for their time, and sorry for maybe going a little bit over.